Short is the story, long is the life.
Wukong's Archive presents China Urban Legends EP13 The Terracotta Army Curse. 1. This story was told to me by a friend of mine. His surname is Wang. I won't give his full name. He's been driving a taxi in Xi'an for over 20 years. Old Wang is a native of Lintong. His hometown is in a village called West Yang Village, less than 3 kilometers east of the Terracotta Warriors Museum. He says that in all his years driving, 8 out of 10 tourists he's picked up were going to see the Terracotta Warriors. He could drive from Xi'an train station to the gates of the museum with his eyes closed. But Old Wang says that place, the Terracotta Warriors, is 2 completely different things by day and by night. I asked him what he meant. He said, during the day you go see them, thousands of terracotta soldiers lined up in neat rows. You stand at the edge of the pit looking down, and it's truly magnificent. But have you ever noticed one thing? Almost everyone who visits the Terracotta Warriors, after they come out of the pits, doesn't feel like talking much. I thought about it, and it did seem to be true. I went to see the Terracotta Warriors once, 10 years ago. I walked through Pit 1, Pit 2, and Pit 3. When I came out, I stood at the entrance and smoked a cigarette, not saying a word. It wasn't that I wasn't impressed, it was that the feeling was beyond words. Those clay figures standing in the pits, each face different, some smiling, some angry, some expressionless. If you stare at them long enough, you feel like they're staring back at you.
Old Wang said, I played on that land as a child, back before the Terracotta Warriors were even discovered. We called that area Ghost Mound Slope. The village elders never let children go there to play. I didn't understand why when I was young. I only found out later. 2. Spring 1974, West Yang Village, Lintong County. Old Wang was 9 years old that year. He said that spring was especially dry. The wheat seedlings in the fields were almost dead from drought. The ground had cracked open in long fissures, crunching underfoot when you stepped on them. At the end of March, a few production brigade members were digging a well south of the village. The spot was called Persimmon Tree Garden because there was a huge persimmon tree growing there, its canopy shading half an acre of ground, its trunk so thick that a grown man couldn't wrap his arms around it. The well was being dug right under that persimmon tree, at a spot an old villager had pointed out. The old man said the soil under the persimmon tree was loose, easy to dig through. Later, some people said the reason that persimmon tree grew so thick was because the ground beneath it wasn't solid.
Nothing unusual happened on the first day of digging. They went down about a meter. The soil was just like anywhere else, yellowish-brown, with a few broken tiles mixed in. On the afternoon of the second day, a commune member named Yang Jifa swung his pickaxe and hit something hard. He said the pickaxe bounced back, jarring his hand until his whole arm went numb. He thought he'd hit a rock. He crouched down and scraped at the dirt with his hands, and what he uncovered wasn't a rock. It was a round thing, grayish-brown, with patterns on it. Yang Jifa pulled it out and turned it over in his hands. Later, an older man in the village came over to look. He said it was a pottery human head, just a head, no body, made to look exactly like a real person. Even the lines behind the ears were there. Old Wang said he stood far off to the side watching. His father was also in the well-digging crew. He saw his father go over and glance at that pottery head, and then his face changed color. His father didn't say anything. He walked over to the side, squatted down, and rolled a cigarette with shaking hands. The other villagers crowded around to look, all talking at once. Some said it was a tomb artifact. Some said it was a clay Buddha from an old temple. Others said it was unlucky and should be buried back immediately. Yang Jifa put the pottery head on the edge of the well and kept digging. By afternoon, they dug up several more pottery body parts, arms, legs, torsos, all exactly the same size as a real person's. Even the fingernails and toenails were carved in clear detail. These body parts still had traces of painted colors: red, green, blue, purple, bright and vivid. Some parts still had gold leaf attached, glittering in the sunlight. But within less than an hour of being exposed to the sun, the colors began to fade, as if blown away by the wind. The gold leaf began to curl at the edges and fall off. Old Wang said one of the commune members touched the paint with his finger, and it crumbled off like chalk dust. Old Wang said he remembered it very clearly. When they knocked off work that evening, there were 7 human heads, a dozen or so pottery body parts, and a pile of horse leg and tail fragments lined up by the well. The setting sun shone on them, and the expressions on those pottery heads looked different from every angle. One head was tilted slightly to the side, the corners of its mouth lifted in what looked like a smile. One head was bowed, as if looking down at the ground beneath its feet. Another had its chin lifted, its mouth slightly open, as if it wanted to say something but couldn't get the words out.
Old Wang said that when he looked at that smiling head, his heart lurched. He felt like that smile wasn't directed at anyone else, it was directed at him. He looked away, and when he turned back, the pottery head was still facing the same direction, still wearing the same expression. But it just felt wrong. He ran home and didn't dare look again. 3. Word spread fast. Staff from the Lintong County Cultural Center arrived. A few officials came by bicycle, having ridden more than 30 kilometers. When they reached the well and saw what was there, they stood frozen. One of them crouched down and touched the pottery shards, his hand trembling slightly. He ordered the well-digging site protected and immediately rode his bicycle back over 30 kilometers to report to the county seat. A few days later, someone from the province arrived. An archaeologist named Zhao. When Mr. Zhao arrived on site, he had the commune members collect all the excavated pottery fragments, then led a team to dig several exploratory trenches around the persimmon tree. Within 2 days of digging, 6 or 7 meters underground, they found more terracotta figures. Row after row of them, buried in neat formation underground, all facing east. Some were standing, some kneeling, some leading horses, some still holding real bronze swords in their hands, buried for 2,100 years, yet the blades were still sharp enough to cut paper. Old Wang said he remembered Mr. Zhao crouching at the edge of the exploratory trench, looking at those terracotta figures, silent for a very long time. When he finally stood up, he said one thing. He said, "We may have found the first emperors."
Old Wang said he heard that sentence from the side. He didn't understand what first emperor meant at the time, but from the adult's expressions, he knew it was something enormous. When Mr. Zhao said those words, his voice was very low, as if talking to himself. He took off his gloves and touched the face of the nearest figure. That figure's face was thickly coated with dirt. Only one eye and one cheekbone exposed. Mr. Zhao touched that half-face, his fingers pausing on the pottery surface for a moment. Then he withdrew his hand. Later, someone asked Mr. Zhao what he felt when he touched that figure. Mr. Zhao said nothing special. It was just cold. But the expression on his face when he said it was not a nothing special expression. But the strange things started from the very first day the terracotta warriors were discovered.
Old Wang said that on the second night after the well digging, Yang Jifa sat bolt upright in bed in the middle of the night and let out a loud shout. His wife was terrified awake and asked him what was wrong. Yang Jifa said he'd had a dream. A soldier in armor was standing by his bed, covered in dirt, his face caked with mud, only one eye visible, staring at him. The soldier said something, but Yang Jifa couldn't make out the words. His wife said it was just a dream, go back to sleep. But Yang Jifa tossed and turned, unable to fall back asleep. He lay there with his eyes open until dawn. He said he could never forget that eye. It wasn't a normal person's eye. It slanted upward, with highbrow bones and deep eye sockets, like the eyes in ancient paintings. He waited until daybreak, then ran straight to the well to look. The pottery heads were still there. He crouched down and found the one with the sideways smile. He found it. That figure's eyes were exactly that upward slanting shape. Yang Jifa never wanted to talk about that well again, for many years afterward. He moved away and never farmed near Persimmon Tree Garden again. Old Wang said his father also couldn't sleep that night. His father came home, washed his hands, ate dinner, and barely said a word all evening. Old Wang asked his father what was wrong. His father said, when those pottery heads were dug up, for just a moment he felt that those things weren't made of clay. He couldn't explain why. It was just a feeling. When those pottery heads were unearthed, the expressions on their faces weren't the same as when they'd been buried underground. I asked him what he meant, what was different. Old Wang said his father's exact words were, when those pottery heads were buried underground, they were in a buried state. You couldn't really see any expression. Face to the yellow earth, back to the sky, just lying there. But the moment they were dug up, when the wind hit their faces, the clay muscles came alive. They seemed to be readjusting to this world. He said his father said this and then stopped. Old Wang never asked him about it again. His father passed away in 1998, at the age of 73. 5. The excavation of the Terracotta warriors continued for many years. Pit 1, Pit 2, Pit 3, one by one they were uncovered. Over 8,000 terracotta figures underground, more than 1,000 weapons, several hundred pottery horses, arranged in a complete battle formation, vanguard, main force, left and right flanks, rear guard, everything present, on the scale of an entire combat army corps. The world's attention focused on Xi'an. But the archaeologists themselves knew that there were things about that place that were never spoken of outside.
Old Wang's taxi didn't just carry tourists. He also gave rides to some of the people who had participated in the excavation. In the autumn of 2012, he picked up a man in his 60s from Xi'an train station heading to the Terracotta Warriors Museum. The old gentleman didn't talk much when he got in. Old Wang was used to Xi'an tourists, so he just drove in silence. When they reached Ba Bridge, the old gentleman suddenly spoke, "Do you go there often?" Old Wang said, "Yes, I'm from Lintong." The old gentleman was silent for a moment, then said, "I was on the archaeological team. I was there in the 70s. Old Wang perked up at this. He chatted with the old gentleman as he drove. The old gentleman's surname was Zhou. He'd been a member of the Pit 1 excavation team. Mr. Zhou said that during the Pit 1 excavation, there was one thing that the team members rarely mentioned afterward. Old Wang asked what it was. Mr. Zhou said that the front row of Pit 1 held a line of terracotta figures that formed the vanguard of the army, over 200 of them. These vanguard figures were different from the ones behind them. They wore no armor, only battle robes. They carried bows and arrows, with no protection on their bodies. They were in the most forward, sacrificial position in the entire army. The archaeological team numbered and catalogued every figure, photographing them for the records. When they reached the figure numbered G1-086, they encountered a strange problem. That figure stood at the easternmost end of the vanguard line, the very front position of the entire battle formation. Its posture was no different from the other vanguard figures, left leg slightly forward, right hand gripping a bow, left hand raised, eyes looking ahead. But no matter how they cleaned it, the dirt on this figure's face simply wouldn't come off. For the other figures, a soft brush would gently sweep away 2,000 years of accumulated soil, revealing the natural color of the pottery body underneath. But this one was different. When the brush touched its face, the soil loosened. But when the brush was lifted, the soil would stick itself back on. They tried 5 times. The same thing every time. Mr. Zhou said the young man doing the cleaning was a kid in his 20s named Xiaoli. Xiaoli didn't believe in such things. He got a small trowel and a spray bottle, deciding to wash the dirt off with water. He gently sprayed a little water onto that face, then softly brushed it with a soft brush a couple of times. The dirt came off, revealing a complete human face. But Xiao Li's hand suddenly stopped. That figure's face was different from all the others. The other figures' faces were grayish-brown pottery. Though they were 2,100 years old, they still looked like clay-fired objects. But this figure's face, you couldn't say exactly why, it didn't look like pottery. It looked too much like real human skin. Not the color, not the texture. It was something that couldn't be put into words. Xiao Li crouched in front of that figure for a long time. When he stood up, he turned to Mr. Zhou and said one thing. He said, "Mr. Zhou, it looks like it's looking at me." Mr. Zhou said when he heard that, his heart tightened. He walked over and crouched down to look at the figure himself, studying it for a long time. He later said that figure's pottery texture was indeed different from the others. The clay on its face was extremely fine, so fine you could barely see any particles, as if it had been made from very fine, clarified clay, slurry that had been filtered a dozen times before firing. And the carving of its facial features, when you looked closely, it wasn't that you felt it was looking at you. It was that you genuinely couldn't determine which direction it was looking. If you looked at it from the left, its eyes seemed to be looking to the left. If you walked to the right, its eyes seemed to follow you to the right. If you crouched down, it seemed to be looking down at you. If you stood up, its gaze seemed to fall at chest level. Mr. Zhou said there was an old craftsman on the archaeological team named Chen. Old Chen had worked with cultural relics in Shaanxi his whole life and had seen all kinds of strange things. Old Chen came over, took one look at that figure, and without saying a word, took a piece of white cloth from his toolbox and covered the figure's face. Everyone was stunned. Old Chen said, "Cover it for now. Don't remove it. Wait until the higher-ups come to see." That figure remained covered with white cloth for 3 days. 3 days later, a cultural relic expert from Beijing arrived. After examining it, the expert gave no special instructions, just said to continue cleaning and document everything. The white cloth was removed. The figure was cleaned, numbered, photographed, catalogued, just like all the others, and sent to the restoration room. But Xiao Li later requested a transfer out of Pit 1. He went to work in logistics in Pit 3. When someone asked him why, he said no particular reason, he just didn't want to see that figure anymore. Later, Xiao Li returned to his hometown. Word has it he became a civil servant and left the cultural relics industry entirely. 6. In 1998, Old Wang gave a ride to a local from Lintong, a man in his 60s, who asked to go to the Terracotta Warriors Museum. The man stared out the window the whole way without speaking. When they reached the museum gate, he didn't get out. He sat in the passenger seat, watching the crowds of tourists streaming through the entrance. After about 2 or 3 minutes of silence, he suddenly said to Old Wang, "Did you know that before the well was dug, nobody ate the persimmons from that big persimmon tree?" Old Wang said, "What do you mean?" The man said he was from the village next to West Yang village. As a kid, he'd herded cattle with the West Yang kids. He said that persimmon tree was enormous. Every autumn, it was covered with bright red persimmons, so thick they looked like a field on fire from a distance. But no one in the village ever picked those persimmons to eat. He once asked an older kid from West Yang why. The kid said the ground under that persimmon tree wasn't clean. It used to be a mass grave. They buried people who died unnatural deaths there. The persimmon tree's roots went deep, drinking from those rotting corpses. Who would dare eat the fruit? Old Wang said he'd never heard this before. He'd played in that area as a child, but he had no memory of that persimmon tree ever bearing fruit. He later specifically asked his mother. She was over 80 but still clear-headed. She confirmed it, nobody ate them. No one ever touched the persimmons from that tree. It wasn't that someone had said not to eat them. It was just that there was an unspoken understanding in the village that trees' fruit was off limits. His mother also told him a detail he'd never heard before. She said that under that persimmon tree were buried not just people who died unnatural deaths, but also a group of craftsmen who had built the mausoleum. She'd heard it from her own grandmother when she was little. Huang's mausoleum took 39 years to build, conscripting over 700,000 workers. When the mausoleum was finished, the craftsmen were sealed alive inside the underground palace. This is even recorded in historical texts. The records of the Grand Historian says that after the first emperor was buried, the second emperor, to prevent the craftsmen from leaking the secrets of the mausoleum, locked all the craftsmen inside, none came out. But what the historical texts don't record is that some of the craftsmen were killed before the tomb was sealed. Their bodies were buried in the outer perimeter of the mausoleum, specifically in places nobody would notice. Persimmon Tree Garden was one of those places. That persimmon tree grew so thick not because the soil was fertile, but because so many bodies were buried beneath it. Old Wang said his mother spoke in a very matter-of-fact tone, like she was stating something she'd known since childhood. And before the terracotta warriors were discovered, this was indeed common knowledge passed down by the elders in Lintong's villages. Don't dig recklessly in that area. Don't eat the fruit from that tree. Don't go there too late. Nobody said why, but everyone followed these rules. If it hadn't been for the severe drought of 1974 forcing them to dig a well there, those rules might have been passed down forever. 7. There was another story, told by a passenger Old Wang picked up in 2004. That summer, a man in his 30s took a taxi from Xi'an City to Lintong, saying he was going to visit a friend. He chatted with Old Wang the whole way. He said he used to work in the restoration room at the Terracotta Warriors Museum for 4 years. He quit later. Old Wang asked why. The man was silent for a moment, then said, because of a pair of hands. Old Wang asked, whose hands? The man said the restoration room's job was to piece together the fragments of unearthed terracotta figures. When the terracotta warriors were unearthed, most of them were broken, some burned by Xiongnu back in the day, some crushed by the falling earth that had buried them, some shattered by 2,100 years of tectonic movement. The restorer's job was to match thousands of fragments together, piece by piece, to reconstruct a complete figure. The man said he worked in this trade for 4 years. He restored about 40 figures. Most of the work was tedious, like assembling a 3,000-piece 3D puzzle with diagrams and numbers, following procedures step by step. But there was one figure he still remembered to this day. That figure came from Pit 3. It was a general figure. A full head taller than the ordinary terracotta soldiers. It wore a double-layer battle robe with a coat of armor on top, the armor decorated with painted patterns. When it was unearthed, this general figure was broken into over 30 fragments. The head alone was in 4 pieces. It took him about 2 weeks in the restoration room to match all the fragments, gluing them with resin, filling in the gaps, and smoothing them down. On the last day, he glued on the last small piece, the right half of the general's chin, applied the resin, sanded it smooth, then stepped back to look at the result. He said that in that moment when he stepped back, his whole body went rigid. The general figure's face was facing forward, its eyes looking straight ahead. He said he was standing in front of the restoration table, directly facing the figure. It was normal that the figure's eyes were looking at him. But when he stepped back, his gaze shifted from the left front to directly in front. And in that moment of movement, he clearly saw that figure's eyes followed him. Just a tiny shift. Not much. But it was absolutely not an illusion. Both his eyes and his brain registered this information simultaneously. He stood frozen, staring at that figure's eyes for at least a full minute. The figure didn't move again. But he knew in his heart that what had just happened was real. He didn't tell anyone. After finishing that general's restoration, he filled out the final registration form, handed it off to the next stage, and 2 months later resigned. He said he never again set foot inside the Terracotta Warriors Museum, and never mentioned this experience to anyone. Old Wang asked him where that general figure was displayed now. The man said it should be in the General Figures exhibition area in Pit 1. If you go next time, you can look for it. He said he didn't want to know exactly where. 8. Old Wang said he later researched the Terracotta Warriors extensively. He said the more you understand the historical background of that place, the more you feel like there are things about it that make your blood run cold. Huang began building his mausoleum at the age of 13. It took 39 years. The mausoleum is located at the northern foot of Mount Li. The Terracotta Warriors pits are 1.5 kilometers east of the mausoleum. Some say the 8,000 terracotta figures face east because the first emperor's homeland was in the east, and he wanted to gaze toward his native land even in death. Others say it's because to the east lay the 6 kingdoms he conquered. He wanted his army to continue guarding him, to prevent the ghosts of the 6 kingdoms from coming to settle scores. But there's another explanation that Old Wang heard from an old man in Lintong. That old man was surnamed Han. In 2015, he was already 91 years old. When he was young, Old Han herded sheep at the foot of Mount Li and had dealings with the archaeological team. He said that when Huang built his mausoleum, he used large quantities of mercury. Sima Qian wrote in the records of the Grand Historian, mercury was used to simulate the 100 rivers, the great seas, and the great rivers, powered by mechanical devices. Above, the celestial bodies, below, the geography. Later, the archaeological team tested the soil above the sealed mound of Huang's mausoleum. The mercury concentration was abnormally high, dozens of times higher than normal soil. In other words, what the records of the Grand Historian wrote might be true. The first emperor's burial chamber contained flowing mercury, simulating rivers and seas. Old Han said, but what you don't know is that the mercury distribution wasn't uniform. He said when the archaeological team did their measurements, they found that within the entire area of the Terracotta Warriors pits, the section where the easternmost row of vanguard figures stood had mercury concentrations, not just a little higher, but an entire order of magnitude higher than anywhere else. It was the highest mercury concentration area in the entire pit. I said, is that documented?
Old Han said, I was the one who helped collect a sample. I was just a shepherd. I didn't understand the science. I just carried a few bags of dirt for them. But I knew that data. When Mr. Zhao got that data, he sat alone in the work shed for 2 hours and wouldn't see anyone. Later, I saw an appendix about mercury content in an excavation report, 18 pages, covered in data tables. In the last column on the 18th page, there was a number that had been blotted out with ink. I asked a friend who worked at the Cultural Relics Bureau about it. He said that data was never cited in any officially published paper. I asked Old Han, did Mr. Zhao ever mention this to you all later? Old Han said no. Mr. Zhao was later transferred away. He went to Beijing and never did frontline excavation again. Some say he changed careers. Some say he was organizing materials that couldn't be made public. No one knows what he saw. No one knows why he left. Old Wang also heard another story from Old Han. Old Han said that when the Qin dynasty craftsmen made the terracotta figures, they would carve their own names on the inside wall of each figure. This was the Qin dynasty's inscribed the maker's name system. Every object had to have the maker's name carved on it, so that if something went wrong, the responsible party could be traced. The Terracotta Warriors were no exception. Later, during cleaning in the restoration room, the archaeological team discovered that many figures had their makers' names carved on the inside of their lapels. the back of their armor plates, or under their hair buns, in small seal script. Some were carved by a single craftsman, some listed several names together. Those names were the final traces those craftsmen left behind 2,100 years ago. Old Han said, "Have you noticed that the museum's exhibit descriptions almost never mention those names? It's not that the archaeological team didn't find them. It's that those names can't really be talked about. Some of those craftsmen's names can't be found in any historical record. They belong to the commoner class with no place in written history. 2,100 years ago, when they carved their names there, they already knew that no one except themselves and the first emperor would ever know those names existed. But it was still a person's name. That person lived and breathed, and used his hands to shape the faces of those terracotta figures. He put everything he had into that handful of clay."
Old Wang said he later went to the Terracotta Warriors Museum and pressed his face close to the glass to look at the inside of the figure's lapels. Through the glass, he couldn't see a thing. But he knew those names were there. For 2,100 years, they've been there. Accompanying the tomb-guarding terracotta figures, guarding a mausoleum that has never been opened. 9. In 2014, the Pit 1 Terracotta Warriors held an exhibition of findings from the third excavation phase. Old Wang went specifically to see it. He said he saw one particular exhibit, not a complete terracotta figure, but a bronze sword. The sword was unearthed from Pit 1. It was 91 centimeters long and 3 centimeters wide. The blade had dark floral diamond patterns that gave off a dark green matte gleam under the spotlights. This sword had been discovered pinned beneath a terracotta figure weighing 150 kilograms for 2,100 years. The blade had been bent into a graceful curve. But when the archaeologists removed the figure, the sword's blade snapped back to its original shape within minutes. The edge was still sharp. Old Wang said he stood in front of that sword for a long time.
He said bronze has memory. Bent for 2,100 years, the moment the pressure was removed, it snapped back to the shape it held 2,100 years ago. So did it remember anything else? What had it seen 2,100 years ago? In whose hand had it been held? What had it cut? The dark patterns on it were said to be the result of chromium salt oxidation treatment, a modern metallurgical technique, yet the Qin people had already used it over 2,100 years ago. Old Wang said as he stood there, a thought occurred to him, a thought he himself knew was absurd. If a bent bronze sword could return to its original shape, then could things that had been buried for 2,000 years also be waiting for a chance to return to what they once were? 10. Old Wang said there was one more thing. In the autumn of 2016, a female graduate student from a university history department, surname Lin, got in touch with Old Wang through a mutual friend. She said she wanted to do an oral history project on the Terracotta Warriors and wanted to talk to some elderly locals in Lintong. Old Wang helped her connect with a few elderly villagers, including Old Han and a former security guard at the Terracotta Warriors Museum named Lu. Uncle Lu was in his 60s. He'd been a security guard at the museum for 8 years, retiring in 2006. He said he'd done all kinds of work in his life, but the museum security job was the longest he'd ever held. Not because he liked it, because, he said, he couldn't bear to leave. Old Wang asked why he couldn't bear to leave. Uncle Lu said, "That Pit 1, it's not quiet at night." Old Wang asked what he meant. Uncle Lu was silent for a moment, then said, "You can't really describe it. I'm not the kind of person who talks nonsense. I served 5 years in the military. After I was discharged, I worked in a factory, worked on construction sites, drove for a boss. I'm not a coward. But that Pit 1, at night, especially in the wee hours, when you're standing alone at the edge of the pit, you can hear sounds." Old Wang asked what kind of sounds. Uncle Lu said, "Not footsteps, not voices. It's the sound of the earth. The soil inside those terracotta figures makes a very faint, very fine noise in the nighttime, like the clay was breathing. At first, he thought it was thermal expansion and contraction, since Lintong has a big temperature difference between day and night, hot during the day, cold at night, so pottery making crackling sounds from temperature changes would be normal. But he later realized something was off, because the other pottery objects in the museum, Xi'an bricks, roof tiles, clay pots, didn't make that sound. Only those terracotta figures made that sound. It was more like, he searched for the right word, like thousands of clay figures all adjusting their positions at the same time. Like they'd been underground for 2,000 years, their joints stiff, and at night when no one was watching, they quietly stretched out.
Uncle Lou said he never walked down the middle path through Pit 1 during his night shifts. He always took the perimeter route. During an 8-hour night shift, he'd walk the perimeter, stop at the stairwell to Pit 3, face the wall and smoke a cigarette, then walk back. The entire night, he tried not to look at Pit 1. He admitted to me, in 8 years as a security guard, he never once looked at the terracotta figures in Pit 1 at night. Not once. His rules for night duty were, don't look at Pit 1, don't take the middle path, don't stand alone by the pit for more than 10 seconds. But one time he had to break his own rules. It was an autumn night in 2003, around 2 a.m. A loud sound suddenly came from inside the museum, like something falling over. The phone in the security office rang. It was the surveillance room saying something might have fallen in Pit 1, and he needed to go in and check. Uncle Lou said he cursed under his breath, then picked up his flashlight, put on his jacket, and opened the door to Pit 1. He said he stood in the doorway, sweeping his flashlight beam inside. The entire Pit 1 area was pitch black. The beam fell on the silhouettes of the terracotta figures, like rows upon rows of gray shadows standing there. He took a few steps. The flashlight beam swept across the front row, the vanguard figures. He said that at first he thought he was seeing things. He pulled the beam back and shone it on that row of vanguard figures again. And then every hair on his body stood on end.
He said the vanguard figures' stances were different from what they were during the day. During the day, the vanguard figures stood with left foot forward, right foot back, in an archery stance, bodies leaning forward, a posture ready for battle. But what he saw that night, or at least what he thought he saw, was that several figures had both feet together. Those figures stood straight upright, their bodies rigid, like soldiers standing guard, not like archers about to shoot. He shone his flashlight on them 3 times. Every time, he was certain he saw something different. He didn't dare go any further. He backed out of the door and locked it. He went back to the security office and called the shift supervisor. The supervisor came. Together, they opened the door and shone a light into Pit 1. This time, what he saw, the vanguard figures were back in their left foot forward, right foot back stance. Exactly the same as during the day. The supervisor said he definitely must have seen things. Uncle Lou didn't argue. But he said he knew what he saw. He was a military man. His eyes adapted to darkness better than most. He'd shown the light 3 times. All 3 times he'd seen the feet together. And when he opened the door again a few minutes later, it was back to the archery stance. He had no way to explain it. He only knew that during those few minutes when the door was locked, those things inside might have thought they wouldn't be disturbed. 11. There was another story Old Wang heard from a cultural relic trafficker in Lintong. The man's surname was Ma. Born in the 1960s, he dug in the Mount Lee area when he was young, then turned to relic trafficking. Ma was fairly well known in the Lintong area, not because of how much he'd trafficked, but because he had his own theory. He said the terracotta warriors couldn't be touched. If you touched them, something bad would happen. He said 3 or 4 of his men had picked up pottery shards from the edge of the pits to sell, and later all of them had met with misfortune. 1 got into a car accident, 1 was diagnosed with liver cancer, and 1 went insane. Old Wang said he wasn't sure if those stories were true. But Ma's own experience was definitely real. Ma said that in the 1990s, a collector from the south offered a high price for a complete terracotta warrior's head. Ma was tempted. He found a few men and sneaked into the unexcavated outer perimeter of the terracotta warriors' protected area at night. They used Luoyang spoons to probe for 3 nights, finding a spot that seemed to contain a buried figure. He said they dug until past 2 a.m. that night, going down about 2 meters. The soil brought up by the Luoyang spoon indeed contained fine pottery fragments. They got excited and dug faster. After another half-meter or so, the Luoyang spoon brought up something, a finger. A pottery finger, life-sized, remarkably well-preserved. The tip was slightly curved, the joint creases clearly carved. Ma said when he held that pottery finger, his hands were shaking. Not from excitement. From fear. He couldn't explain why, but what he held in his hand didn't feel like pottery. It felt like a real finger. The sensation of holding that pottery finger, cold, smooth, heavy, was almost indistinguishable from holding a dead person's finger. He threw it back into the hole on the spot. He told his partners, "We're not digging. Backfill it." They buried that finger backfilled all the excavated soil, and tried to restore the site to its original condition as best they could. Ma said that on the walk back, none of them said a word. When they reached the car, one of them suddenly crouched down and vomited. The others said nothing. They got in the car and drove away. Ma said he never again had any thoughts about the terracotta warriors. The sensation of that pottery finger, he said he'd never forget it for the rest of his life. He didn't know about others, but he felt those terracotta figures weren't made to be seen. They'd been there for 2,000 years. That's where they belonged. Digging them up was like waking something that shouldn't be woken. 12. There was one more detail that Old Wang discovered himself. He said he'd driven countless tourists to the terracotta warriors. But there was one phenomenon he'd never mentioned to anyone. He said every time he drove near the Terracotta Warriors Museum, just past the Lintong toll booth, turning onto the dedicated road to the museum, the radio signal in his car cut out. Not the kind of intermittent static. It vanished completely. A single crackle, then nothing but white noise. About a kilometer past the museum, the signal would come back on its own. He'd tested it many times. It wasn't a coincidence. It happened every time. He said he'd asked other taxi drivers about it. Not everyone had noticed it. But those who had all said the same thing, the phenomenon was real. Some said it was because of magnetic anomalies in the ground beneath that area. Some said it was because of the massive amounts of mercury under Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum, mercury vapor affecting the radio signals. Old Wang said he didn't know which explanation was right. But every time the radio went crackle and died, he knew he'd arrived. That stretch of road was about 2 kilometers. 2 kilometers of silence. The same every time. 13. There was one more thing that Old Wang saw online. He said that in the many years the Terracotta Warriors Museum had been open, one number had been constantly changing, the display count of figures in Pit 1. This number decreased every year. Not the total number of figures, but some of the displayed figures were removed to the restoration room and never returned. The official explanation was routine maintenance and cultural relic protection needs. But Old Wang said he knew someone who worked in the museum's logistics department. That person told him that most of the figures removed weren't going for maintenance. Old Wang asked what he meant. That person said some figures, after being on display for a while, started developing problems, not physical damage. When they were displayed in the exhibition hall, some visitors would complain that they felt like those figures were staring at them. If you thought it was just isolated visitor delusions, you'd be wrong. He said there were several occasions where entire groups of visitors reported the same figure in the same position was off. The museum had no choice but to remove that figure and replace it with another one. The removed figure was sent to the restoration room to rest for a while, then put back in a different position. To an outsider, this operation was completely invisible. But some of the figures in Pit 1 had already been swapped several times.
Old Wang said he didn't know whether to believe it or not. But the next time he went to the Terracotta Warriors, he did pay attention. A few of the forward vanguard figures at the eastern end of Pit 1, which he'd seen on his last visit, were indeed gone. Their positions were empty. The label read, "This artifact is under maintenance." He remembered what that young restorer had said. Out of over 40 figures he'd restored, only that one, he felt it move. He also remembered what Uncle Lou the security guard had said, "Things that guard tombs, you can't stare at them too long." 14. Old Wang told me all this while we sat at a barbecue stall on Xi'an's Muslim quarter. It was getting late. The streets were thinning out. A shop selling lamb palma was closing up, the owner pulling down the steel roll-down door with a clatter. Dogs barked somewhere at the end of the old street. The charcoal fire for the barbecue glowed red, sending up plumes of fragrant smoke. At the next table, a few young men were playing drinking games. At the farthest table, an old woman silently ate a bowl of cold noodles, very slowly. I asked him, "Did that graduate student Xiaolin ever finish her paper?"
Old Wang said she did. He'd helped Xiaolin visit several old people's homes. She'd compiled dozens of hours of recordings and written a field research report of over 10,000 words. But in her thesis, she only used the materials that met academic standards. The unscientific things the old people had told her, she didn't include a single one. In the acknowledgments section, she wrote a paragraph thanking each interviewee for their candid sharing, noting that a large amount of material fell outside the scope of this study, and expressing hope for deeper exploration in future research. I said, "Isn't that a shame?" Old Wang said, "No. Some things, even if you tell them, nobody would believe them." Xiaolin told me herself that after interviewing those old people, she couldn't sleep for several nights. She said she wasn't a superstitious person. But when she was organizing the recordings, she found that several key sections had strange noise in the background. It sounded like someone breathing, but when she'd conducted the interviews, there were only two people in the room, herself and the interviewee. Old Wang never followed up on that. He took a sip of beer, then said something I remember to this day. He said, "The Terracotta Warriors aren't burial objects. They're tomb guardians. And tomb guardians, you can't stare at them too long." The end.